Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the November 2020 Käthe Kruse International Online Gathering. How exciting to get everybody together to talk about these beautiful and beloved dolls. My name is Rebecca Kaufman, and I'm better known as Steiffgal. So you're probably surprised, what am I doing here at the conference? Well, I'm a little bit surprised too, but really flattered and really delighted to be included. Jonathan Green is a really good friend of mine, and we share a love of beautiful German toys. And it seemed like a natural fit to talk a little bit about Steiff during the Käthe Kruse convention, because many times collectors who love Steiff often love Käthe Kruse and vice versa. One of the things that Steiff creates that is wonderful and charming, that goes beautifully with Käthe Kruse dolls, are farm animals. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking with you about today, the history of Steiff's farm animals and how well and beautifully they display with Käthe Kruse dolls. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And in reality, there are many overlaps between Käthe Kruse and Steiff. They were both companies were started by really strong, intelligent, passionate women who were German at the turn of last century and before. And they both loved children. And really the driving force was to create beautiful and lovely playthings for children. So of course, there are a lot of similarities between the two brands. And I do think it makes perfect sense to talk about them in tandem when the time is right to study them in a lecture sort of manner like this. The other thing that's quite interesting is that both Steiff and Käthe Kruse designed some of their felt dolls based on the same 17th century Baroque statue of an idealized child. So there are some additional overlaps even in doll design. And this doll right here is one of Steiff's pressed felt faced dolls. And you can see here that her face is very similar to Käthe Kruse doll number 1 because they were based on the same sculpture. Anyway, let's get started with the program. And here's our program. Forever Friends, Käthe Kruse dolls and vintage Steiff farm pets. And here you see a lovely mid-century shot. This is a postcard, a series of postcards. The name of the series of postcards is entitled, it translates into English as Little Animal Kindergarten. So here you see this beautiful Käthe Kruse doll with a mid-century Steiff pony, and you will see that again in our presentation. The first type of Steiff farm pets I'd like to share with you are those from the 1920s. And here you can see 3 of these charming pets posed with an early Käthe Kruse doll from the 1920s. And believe it or not, these lovely farm friends are from about the same time. Here you see a little lamb, a beautiful duck, and a beautiful little pink bunny, all from the 20s. And they share the characteristics of being very innocent, very sweet, feminine, and colorful. You'll see that on 1920s era Steiff pets made for the farm. Now let's take a closer look at these 3 1920 era pets. The first one I'd like to share with you is the little duck. You probably caught your eye for his wonderful coloring. And he is made out of mohair with what's called double thick felt beak and feet. You see his little button on his feet, on his little footy. He has no ears. And what's wonderful about this piece is that it is very typical of the 1920s construction, farm and otherwise. And his coloring, which is green, and this was a nice sort of an orangey color, and white, was patched in. This isn't airbrushed or colored. This is actually sewn in this way. Really lovely. His little eyes are backed in felt, red felt, like a little duck would. Very adorable and perfect to pose with a little Käthe Kruse doll. Also featured in that wonderful 1920s picture was this little rabbit. Now, he doesn't look terribly pink on screen, but he is pink. He's baby pink. And one of the things that's very typical of Steiff farm pets and others of the 1920s is that they have these wonderful sort of jelly bean colors. You'd see them in pink, you'd see them in orange, you'd see them in blue and such. And he has a wonderful pink construction and a very innocent and baby face. Very lovely, lovely. This little guy was actually found at a yard sale in a big bag of stuff. So always look in a big bag of stuff. You never know what you can find. And this lovely little lamb, which was also pictured in that first diagram. See how beautiful and innocent that looks? Sort of Very basic, but very charming, very feminine, very baby-like. Has a wonderful texture that almost feels like a lamb. It certainly looks like it. It's sort of a wool and a beautiful bell. That's all original and such. I got him at auction. He belonged to a little girl who was born in the 20s in Germany. And this wonderful lamb now is part of my collection. So here you can see the 3 farm pets. Oops, wish I had another hand. The rabbit, the lamb, and the duck, all from the 1920s. Okay, let's move forward in time. And here you can see a doll from the 1930s, early 1930s and such. And she, of course, is modeling also with some delightful friends from that time period. What you see here is this beautiful girl with her lovely braids. I love her hairstyle and her kindergarten apron, I believe she's wearing. She is posing with a little pony, which you can see is brown and white. She's posing with a little goat and a little rabbit. This rabbit is different than the one we've talked about previously in the other slide, and I'll show you why. He has a secret. And you can see these 1930s animals are a sort of a transition point between sort of the very happy 1920s and the not so happy late 1930s. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, let's take a look at these delightful pieces from the early 1930s. Of course, I bet the little pony caught your eye. He's just adorable, a very sweet and innocent look. And like the duck, he has patched mohair. So this is not colored. This is white mohair. This is brown mohair and this wonderful tail. Lovely innocent look, little felt ears and a mane. He's got black and brown glass pupil eyes. And just a delightful little pony, which would be perfect. Doesn't every girl need a pony? I think so. Every Käthe Kruse girl doll needs one too. So here's a little pony. I love this goat. Isn't he funny? Look at his funny eyes. They're green. And his stitching. I picked him up at a little antique fair in London. I couldn't believe it. I did not have a goat from this era. He just has such a charming look. Very playful. You think of goats and such, just sort of meandering about and being fun and playful. Anyway, this little guy is from the early 1930s. And you can see he is not patched, but he's colored. And you'll start to see more coloring instead of patching as we continue our conversation. And the last treasure I'd like to share with you from the early 1930s is something very typical from the 1930s. And you'll see this on a few farm pets, including a version that came in a lamb. But this version is a rabbit, and he's got a funny little tail and a long neck because he is a head turns tail model. This is very typical for the early 1930s. And a little rabbit, of course, belongs on a farm. And what would be more fun than to have this in the arms of a little Käthe Kruse doll? Little action Jackson. So wonderful. So from the early 1930s, we have the bunny, the funny little goat, and the beautiful pony. Isn't that lovely? How pretty would those be with the Käthe Kruse dolls? The next farm animals I'd like to share with you are from the mid to late 1930s. And what you're going to start seeing in the mid to late 1930s is a sort of decrease in the number of resources used to create the items, as well as the time and creativity involved with them. And by that I mean, by the mid to late 1930s, things were pretty tough at Steiff and across Germany. And so the company was doing everything it could to simplify its designs and patterns while still creating appealing products. And what you're going to see in that case is a lot more painting, a lot more simplification, and a lot more alternative materials beginning to be used throughout the line. So what you see here with this beautiful little boy from the 1950s are 3 farm pets from the mid to late 1930s. And what you see here right in front is a wonderful and very silly pom-pom woolen miniature hen. And Steiff created a series of woolen miniatures starting in the 1930s as a way to create efficient products made from minimal fabrics in a most cost-effective way, which were still appealing and playful and collected. You also see this little calf here. This calf is made out of wool plush, and we'll talk about that. That's a fabric very typical of the period. And then the other farm friend that you see here on the left is a chamois goat. Now, he might necessarily be on the farm, but he would certainly be visiting the farm probably living in the hills and valleys around the farm, but he certainly qualifies as a farm friend in this case. Let's take a deep dive into these beautiful pieces. So let's talk a little bit more about what we've seen in the previous slide. What we have here, of course, is the chamois. Lovely, beautiful, very authentic looking piece. He is made out of an interesting sort of a woolen plush. It's not mohair, because mohair was starting to get very expensive at this time. He is really made out of a combination of wool, mohair, and perhaps even something else. His texture is a little bit more coarse than you see on a mohair piece, but just beautiful. And he comes to visit the friends at the farm. Talked a little bit about a calf. Now this calf is just lovely, and he is made out of entirely a woolen plush material with spots that are airbrushed on. It's a very sweet and innocent look, very simplified design out of a less expensive transitional wartime fabric, but you can still see very, very appealing. I got this from a friend. She offered him to me. I couldn't believe it because I was always looking for the farm friend from this era made from this material, and she's just a lovely material, a lovely presentation, and just looks charming with a doll. And the third little piece in that vignette with the doll, of course, your farm friend, the rooster. How lovely is that? Kind of funny and goofy, made out of pom-poms. It's like what you see on the top of a hat or decorating on a ruff, but he's made out of pom-poms and felt with googly eyes. And even though he's relatively simple and inexpensive, his head turns. Steiff always did a great job in creating beautiful products, even with minimal fabrics, resources, and such. But these lovely pom-poms were really introduced in the early to mid 1930s, and the heyday of them was through the pre-war period, where they came in these wonderful designs and goofy fabrics and goofy designs and colors. Such lovely, simply lovely. Now let's move forward in time to the late 1940s to the early 1950s era. And this was, of course, a very good time for Steiff farm pets as well. And you can see these beautiful farm friends posing with this adorable little girl, probably from around the same time. Now, what was happening in the late 1940s through the early 1950s? The war had ended, and Steiff was starting to produce their wonderful farm and animal friends again. What you see typically during this period are items that span both pre and post-war production and the beginning of new ideas coming through. What you see here on the left is a wonderful pony, which is made out of a very similar fabric to the ones that were made pre-war. This is sort of a woolen plush with a sort of a composite type of fabric associated with him. He does have a mohair mane. You see a silk plush deer. And of course, silk plush is another fabric that was typical to the wartime, just before and just after the wartime production. And here you see a little donkey, which debuted in the late 40s or very early 50s, a new design for Steiff. And we'll talk a little bit about his role in the transition between pre and post-war production as well. All right, let's first talk about this wonderful silk plush deer, wonderful friend that would visit the farm, if not living on one, visit his friends. And this is a lovely piece. This is made out of artificial silk plush, which is a really cool fabric. It starts out beautiful and silky and soft and really appealing. It gets kind of playwear worn really, really quickly. It tends to matte and get a little gray and unshiny, but this is a really nice example of an item from this period. It's just quite lovely. And you would see him adorably posed with a Käthe Kruse doll. Beautiful, silk plush. Late 1940s, for sure. It's wonderful ID. You can see here, indicating he's from that time. We also took a look at that pony, and this is a similar pony to the one that we saw in the very first slide with the little girl posing with the animal kindergarten. And he's also made of a sort of an interesting woolen composite, maybe a little mohair, maybe a little wool. He's scratchier than mohair, although you can see he has a full mohair mane and felt ears and such. Again, a pony, perfect for a farm, perfect for a little Käthe Kruse doll, and also from the late 1940s, early 1950s period. He would go on to be made in all mohair when that fabric became available. A very interesting farm friend, and certainly one you'd see helping out, a beast of burden, is a wonderful donkey, would appear on a farm, adorably posed with the Käthe Kruse doll. This one is a very early model. He has his US zone tag, and I believe Käthe Kruse also dolls would have something like this on animals that were produced in the basically the late 1940s, early 1950s for export and legal reasons. And he's got a wonderful expression. He's made entirely of velvet. He's got a blanket and tassels. He's dressed for success with a long tail with mohair. This item would become very, very popular in the line in the 50s and 60s. The smaller item generally was produced moving forward with a cord tail. You can tell this is the early model because of his ID, his wonderful accessories, and his velvet and not cord tail. Just lovely. And our final little photo of inspiration for you today of Käthe Kruse dolls and Steiff farm pets is this delightful Fritzl. He's from 1996 and was produced in collaboration with Steiff on a special project that year. But what I love about this little boy is how happy he looks with his farm friends from the early to mid 1950s era. And what you see here, clearly very different from the other pets that you saw in the previous part of this program. These little guys are very spunky, they're very colorful, they're very cartoon-like, they're very endearing. And most of all, they have a wonderful size. The size was specifically created in the 1950s and emphasized in the product line, as these were great for people to buy and collect. They didn't take up a lot of room. They weren't terribly expensive to produce in this size. They were easily transportable. When soldiers left Germany and Europe back to the US and their countries after fighting the war, they could take many of these as souvenirs in their coat pockets and trunks and such. So it was a great format for Steiff for distribution and reestablishing itself as a premier toy manufacturer post-World War II with these delightful farm pets and of course, obviously other pets as well. But the size and the design were all part of Steiff's strategy to really relaunch in a big way post-World War II. So let's take a little look at some of these delightful friends. You saw the little boy holding this pig, which of course caught your eye. He's got wonderful blue eyes. His name is Jolantha. And pigs are very important in the German culture. And so obviously Steiff would do a great job in creating this little pig, this little good luck pig perhaps, and such, made out of velvet. It's a little tiny tail. Wonderful farm friend. He never had a chest tag because he's too tiny, but he's beautiful. Imagine him in the arms of a Käthe Kruse or Steiff doll, your choice. Beautiful. Now we have Lammy. Lammy's a little unusual for Steiff. It's a black lamb with green eyes. Usually you see these, a black lamb with blue eyes in the Steiff line, but this Lammy is very typical to the 1950s. Very perky, very fun, very silly, very happy. Beautiful. Posed with a wonderful Käthe Kruse doll. Delightful. Sort of on the silly side, don't you think every doll needs an oxen? This is Oxy, Ox. How cute is that? This wonderful cord tail. He's got a velvet dewlap. He's got little horns in his mouth and such. He's just totally adorable. Again, designed in the 50s. Farm friends. Couldn't be cuter. And I wanted to end the presentation with a farm friends with, of course, a goose. It's my understanding that this program, a goose plays a big role in it. And so I wanted to end on a very high note with this delightful goose whose name is Tulla, T-U-L-L-A. She came in a couple of sizes, but she's so happy and so playful. Her wings are outstretched. She's dancing and happy and would love to be posed with a Käthe Kruse doll. Isn't she beautiful? And you can see that happy, delightful sort of mid-century appeal that she has. Tulla, our lamb with the green eyes, the silly ox, and the pretty pig. We're good. So that's what I have for you. I hope you've enjoyed the program on Käthe Kruse dolls and their wonderful Steiff farm pets. You can see how beautifully and wonderfully they go together. Here's another picture that I found of Käthe Kruse and wonderful Steiff ducklings, also from the mid-century period. So thank you for your time. Thank you for attending the conference. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. If you're interested in learning more about Steiff, you can purchase, learn about, and admire beautiful Steiff vintage goodies at my website, which can be found at www.mysteifflife.com. I welcome your questions and inquiries. My contact information can be found there. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.